In the last video, we explored how the 20th century changed our understanding of truth, moving from a world where truth was seen as fixed and objective to one where truth is understood as shaped by culture, history, and human experience. But this shift didn't just affect science and philosophy, it also transformed theology and led to one of the most critical theological developments of the modern era: contextual theology. That is a way of doing theology that recognizes that theology itself is shaped by culture, history, and lived experience. In this video, we'll explore how theology moved from being seen as a timeless and universal to something deeply shaped by lived experience. Long before these academic discussions emerged, missionaries were already grappling with this question of how theology could be transplanted or contextualized into different regions beyond the Western scope of Christianity. And by the early 20th century, as we know, Christianity had spread across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But missionaries began to notice something. They noticed that their way of contextualizing the gospel message wasn't working. Simply transplanting European theology and church structures wasn't optimal. People weren't just accepting the Christianity as it was taught, they were interpreting it through their own cultural lens. And in response, theologians began to discuss how Christianity could better adapt to different cultural situations. Some churches, for instance, translated the Bible into local languages. Others incorporated indigenous music, arts, and symbols into worship. Catholic documents encouraged the purification of local traditions. That means they accepted some cultural elements but maintained Western theological frameworks. However, despite these adaptations, the core doctrines always remained untouched. Christianity was presented as unchanging, it merely applied to different settings. It was like a plug and play form of Christianity, and it was assumed that Christianity was universal. It just needed the proper cultural adjustments, hence the whole idea of you plug it into a different context and it plays. But in the mid 20th century, a more profound question arose, and that is, what if theology itself is shaped by human experience? Theologians started to realize that adapting Christianity to local cultures wasn't just about changing the packaging, it wasn't just about plugging it in and playing it in different regional and geographic contexts. It meant rethinking the entire process of theology itself. Now, one of the most groundbreaking shifts in this type of thinking was liberation theology that emerged in Latin America. And it was a theologian, a priest called Gustavo Gutierrez. He argued that theology must begin with human experience, especially the struggles of the poor and the oppressed. And he famously defined theology as this critical reflection on Christian practice in light of the Word. That meant that theology isn't just about abstract ideas, it must engage with real world struggles for justice. Now, at the same time that was happening, another movement took shape in the United States called the Black Theology of Liberation. And it was James Cone who argued that theology must be rooted in the experience of the oppressed. The particular context he was speaking about was black identity in the civil rights movement. And he was largely influenced by the black church tradition and black power movement. And Cone emphasized that theology is not neutral, but shaped by history and culture. Now, these movements shared a common realization that theology wasn't just a set of universal doctrines applied to the world, and that theology emerged within communities shaped by their own struggles, histories, and experiences. And now, this was a massive break from traditional theology, which, as I said, was a plug and play type of theology that assumed that truth was timeless and unchanging. But what came next pushed things even further. One of the most critical movements in this shift happened in the 1970s when a Taiwanese theologian named Shoki Coe introduced a new term. That term was contextual theology. Now, like I keep on saying, for years many assumed that theology could be indigenized, meaning it could be adjusted for different cultures while keeping the same core ideas. However, Coe argued that theology needed to go beyond cultural adaptation and that it had to engage directly with the lived realities of people in specific social contexts and historical settings. In other words, theology is not just about culture, it's also about history. It's about how movements for justice, war, and colonization shape theology. Theology is about social location, how race, class, belief, and power structures influence belief. Theology is also about the marginalized, how theology must listen to and respond to those on the edges of society. Now, this opened the door for new theological movements that took seriously the experiences of women, indigenous communities, and the oppressed, as people saw that theology was no longer just about interpreting the ancient texts and then trying to apply them to specific geographical and local situations. It was about engaging with human experience in specific historical moments. So, why does this all matter? Well, it matters because for centuries, theology was assumed to be fixed and universal, that Christian doctrine was timeless and simply needed to be applied in different settings. But contextual theology challenges that idea. It argues that theology is always shaped by human experience, by culture, history, and social reality. Now, as you can imagine, this raises some huge questions. If context shapes theology, then how do we distinguish between divine revelation and human interpretation? If truth is constructed, can anything be universally true? If our understanding of God is constructed, is God true? And then when we think about it, how does this affect the way we do theology today? Now, in the following video, we'll look at two big names in contextual theology. That's Robert Schreiter and Stephen Bevins. But for now, I'd like to hear from you. Should theology adapt to different cultures and historical moments? Or should it stay fixed and universal? Well, drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going.